Okay, welcome everybody to episode 38 of the Academy of Management Review Origin series. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the background to the paper Human Capital Resources Emergence, the role of social capital. And talking with us are the three authors of this paper, Caitlyn Ray, Anthony Nyberg, and Mark Maltarich. I hope I pronounced that pretty close, Mark, but you can correct me in a moment. And we're going to hear the background story to this paper. The three authors on this paper are all at sort of different levels of seniority, so it's an interesting author team in terms of cutting across different levels, and was born out of a time when Caitlyn was a doctoral student at the University of South Carolina. And so for those people who are in doctoral programs thinking about trying to write an AMR paper, trying to assemble a team to do that, and trying to see it through to the finish line, I think this could be really interesting. But before we go any further, let's just ask our three guests to introduce themselves. So Caitlyn, if we can start with you.
Sure. So my name is Caitlyn Ray. I'm currently an assistant professor in the HR studies group at Cornell, the ILR school. So my research interests are very related to this paper, but specifically in the area of strategic HR. I'm really interested in human capital resources. And to me particularly, I see it as I'm really interested in the human part of that. So the social relationships between people, what keeps people together, how do they fit together? Things like that. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you. Anthony?
So my name is Anthony Nyberg. I'm a professor here at the University of South Carolina, and my research is primarily in how organizations compete through people, often through the lens of turnover, compensation, or executive succession.
Mark?
So my name is Mark Maltarich. I'm an associate professor at the University of South Carolina. I've been here about 10 years. And my research relates to human capital resources, but also is interested in combinations of people more broadly. So I get into the groups and teams literature, as well as some research methodology around multi-level issues.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And this whole notion of sort of human capital and competitiveness of organizations sort of feels like it really crosses or from sort of more micro organizational behavior issues into more macro issues. And I think that's really intriguing and also a key part of what you do in this paper. So if you don't mind kicking us off, Caitlyn, with just what is the sort of short, concise description of what this paper is about?
Sure, I'll give it a try in terms of the short and conciseness. But so to me, this paper is about understanding how human capital resources are created and really the process through which they're created. And so I know we keep using the word human capital resources. I think all of us have used it already, but that term really is differentiated from human capital because it's human capital plus synergy or something extra that's kind of created through this process. And so in prior literature, there's acknowledgement that something is changing. So whether we're saying the word changing, amplified, transformed, there's something that's happening that's leading to these synergies or these extra component that's contained in the human capital resource, but it's been a little fuzzy regarding precisely how those changes are being made. So I believe that our paper is helping address those mechanisms that are leading to those changes that result in these differences we might see present in the human capital resource.
And so would you describe it as, and any of you can respond to this, who is the target audience for this paper? Is it more macro people trying to understand why one firm's more competitive or has a greater advantage than another firm? Is it more micro people trying to understand those more micro team-based interactions? Is it explicitly crossing the two? Who's the target audience here?
So to be clear, we would like everybody to cite it. We kind of don't care who reads it, but if everyone could start citing it, that would be helpful. I think Caitlyn really touched on that or explained it quite clearly in terms of there is a literature out there that is talking about the human capital as a resource, right? This started really in 2011 with Fleuhart and Maltarich. And it's unclear, though, how the human capital part really becomes that human capital resource. And this paper is helping understand what those things are that go into that. So the audience, there is a strategic human capital interest group at SMS. So clearly this is designed for that whole group, but it's also designed for anybody, if we think about it from the micro side, that's thinking about pick any topic, selection, training, recruiting, how are those making a bigger impact at the organizational level? This would be appropriate for that group. And from the macro side, anyone that's looking at anything related to what is often referred to as micro foundations, this should inform that audience also. So really, again, almost the entire academy.
I would add to that even in the area of teams, it's a very similar thing where we think about how teams combine and how the combinations of people within the teams influence the outcomes that teams can produce. And I think this does speak to that also.
Yeah. And that's often what we're looking for at AMR is not these papers that are going to just incrementally move a little needle, but give us a bigger, bolder, broader explanation that might actually impact multiple different literatures or multiple different scholars' perspectives. And I think this paper really does that nicely, and it really feels like it covers a lot of ground in an impactful way. Can you give us a little sense of how it got started, Caitlyn? Where did you get the idea from? I'm assuming as the first author, you were at least part of the impetus for that. And then maybe tell us a little bit of how things evolved and how Anthony and Mark got involved and just the genesis of this paper.
Sure, and I'll let Mark and Anthony jump in whenever. But so this
too early to jump in?
No, that's
okay. All right, just checking.
So this actually was the idea for my first year paper. So my first year paper in my PhD program, again, not this form, obviously looked very different from this, but really I was interested in how human capital and social capital combined, kind of at the most basic level. But after my first year paper, which Anthony and Mark were, advising me on, I began having, more serious conversations with them, trying to get a better perspective of how scholars, really thought about this and were thinking about these things. But I also had the benefit in my program of taking a HR seminar and, took a social networking class. So just all these experiences that kind of reaffirmed or kept me interested and motivated in this idea. But really not until Mark and Anthony having more serious conversations with them about dissatisfaction with how we're talking about human capital resources and where they come from. And then also kind of my experiences in social networking and being really interested in what's happening between people. It's just it was, trying to merge those two things together.
Yeah, I'll just add that, especially for those students that are out there, the summer paper, this all started with Caitlyn and the paper, but I don't think that there's probably anything that resembles from that first paper, this final output. And the way, at USC, we require all doctoral students to do a summer paper, and rarely do those become like an AMR like this. And at the end of Caitlyn's first summer, although I now have a lot of false memories, I have to say, they've corrected me on a lot, but at the end of her summer paper, most of the advice was, that was good, you can become a second-year student, but there was not much at least, that said, yeah, this is a great project that should keep going. And it was really through conversations, especially that the three of us had about, is there any nugget out of here that we can continue to build on? And the timing of that was such that Mark and I have been working on a number of other projects. I don't think we'd want to say failed in front of everyone else, but they haven't matured in any meaningful way of trying to get at what that difference is, or trying to develop what that human capital is to become that human capital resource, or understanding the other components that go into the emergence process. And Caitlyn's input, and particularly when she started bringing the social networking, led us to thinking that there more and more value in this topic than we had thought previously. And I don't know, Mark and I probably realized that there was something serious in this project at different times, but it was a procession. I'm sure at the very beginning we were just trying to be nice to her. Yeah, keep working on that. Sure, there might be something there. And then it slowly took form as a real project, right? So the basics were there all along. The interest from Mark and I for sure was there from a lot of projects of trying to understand it, but it was really Caitlyn pushing really hard in terms of trying to understand this, and her not accepting the general assumptions that were in the prior literature that led Mark and I to eventually understanding that this was really important topic and something that could be done.
Yeah, I think when I really knew that we were onto something was in one of these conversations where Caitlyn kept asking the questions, and we're all working from the same set of literature, the same set of ideas. And as she's asking questions, the three of us disagreed about so much. If you asked us right now to go into a lot of depth about what the human capital resource is, I'm not sure we could really agree to too great an extent. And when you think about how these things develop and operate, we just constantly found ourselves in disagreements about what is amplification, what is transformation, what is the human capital, and we really knew that these were things that we couldn't look to the literature for really solid answers about. And so I think that helped us recognize the value of this work.
So it's clear in reading the paper and even explicitly in the title that this is a paper or a manuscript that expands beyond like what you might see as the initial boundaries of HR or even human capital by bringing in this fairly strong sort of social network perspective, and it's built in with the role of social capital into the title. Where were those ideas coming from that were sort of, I guess, helping shed new light or invoke new ideas into the whole notion of human capital resources? Where were you getting those ideas from and sort of testing them out and helping them evolve into something that was adding to, in a fairly significant way, this human capital resources literature?
Yeah, this is purely for Caitlyn. She's really the one that bought it. I do want to add, because this is the only time that Mark and I will ever be able to get this out publicly, but as doctoral students, Mark and I worked on a 1,000 paper meta-analysis on social capital that never even got submitted. So we felt we had a certain expertise that we've been looking to place somewhere and never figured out where until Caitlyn.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I think emergence, which is like very talked about, right, in the HR space, at least, beginning to be talked about as we move towards a multi-level view of human capital resources. But to me, that definition always has something about social in it, right? Like through social exchange, through social interaction. So in a way, to me, it felt, as an outsider reading this for the first time, kind of as an early doctoral student, it felt like very obvious. It's like, oh, there's a term called social capital. Like, let's just bring that in, plug it in, since this concept of emergence and multi-level thinking is so fuzzy. It's like they seem to have some multidimensionality and like this really precise way of talking about it. They have these three dimensions, the structural, relational, cognitive, like this, there's so much richness there that I don't know, like to me, it seemed like a obvious pairing when kind of comparing the two literatures and what was really missing, from the HCR literature at that time.
And so did you just dive into the social network, the social capital literature, sort of become very familiar with it and then begin to bring it out into the theorizing here?
Yeah, I'd say that was fair. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
You sought out formal coursework too on social networks, right, Caitlyn?
Yeah. So I took a social networking class, which was really, really valuable. And again, like in the HR seminar that I was taking, we really like focus very heavily in on human capital resources. And so like we were diving into sociology and psychology, really kind of going back to these foundations. So I think I had a lot of exposure and just interest in it, which led me to pretty deeply diving into that literature.
Now, you've alluded to the fact that Anthony and Mark, you had done this big meta-analysis, so you had this sort of background interest and so on. But what was keeping you engaged or intrigued as the thing continued to evolve? What was making it interesting enough for you to devote time to this instead of to something else? Was it just that you had a doctoral student continually knocking on your door, or was there something else that was sort of kept the thing alive and kept it moving?
Yeah, I think that a lot of credit goes to the doctoral student knocking on the door, not just knocking, but really pushing through and challenging. Mark and I are used to disagreeing on almost every topic, research related, well, and otherwise. But Caitlyn added a third perspective that was really interesting to us, right? It created forced us to look at things differently than we had in the past. So even from a definitional perspective, so Mark and I have done a fair amount of work in the human capital resource space, and Caitlyn really just kept saying, you guys are dumb, right? There's no way this can be true. Think about it. And it was, that level of really great doctoral student that's motivated to make a difference, who's courageous enough to press us. And for all the doctoral students listening, she didn't call us dumb the first year, right? She waited to say that out loud till she had a job at Cornell. So it wasn't, there was a little safety there, but she pushed us constantly. And when there's someone pushing back intellectually like that, that's the most fun we have in this job, right? So that made it great fun to just keep going on this all the time.
Well, Mark? I think it also helps that the idea was right on. We recognize this gap in the literature, this shortcoming, and she had real solutions for it. So I think the disagreements really helped. And every time she called me and Anthony dumb, we both thought she was half right. But so having the really good idea and pressing it. So it wasn't just that she was knocking on the door. She was knocking on the door, telling us things that we eventually recognized were right.
So that solution, just to be right, it's, as Mark said, it's not just pointing out the challenges, right? We all know that. It's coming with creative solutions and being adaptable, right? So, really not every idea she had was great. I'm going to give it like 1 out of 10, maybe. But that one was really good, and she was persistent enough to keep trying to get there.
And so I think within that, there are certainly 2 key lessons. Number one is good AMR papers are born on good ideas. Like if you're starting off with a poor idea or an idea in which the essence of it just doesn't make sense in terms of where the literature is, it's very hard to move from there and to write well enough or to bring in enough interesting perspectives to make that a good paper. And so, Mark, you sort of reiterated the fact that at the core of this, somewhere within the core of this, there's a good idea. But then certainly from a more junior scholar working with more senior scholars, which we often see in author teams of people who want to write conceptual papers, is as the more junior scholar taking ownership, keep pushing, keep challenging. And a lot of what we see as interesting ideas coming out in AMR are often coming from people who are not deeply embedded in the literature, because for Anthony or for Mark, you're too sort of ingrained or brainwashed by what you already know. And so bringing in something new is more difficult. And we've got to depend on people who are newer to the field to do that. And so I really commend you, Caitlyn, for doing that and keeping pushing.
Yeah, Greg, I think you've really captured that well, that the combination of the naivete, but in a good way, along with some people that are a little bit more established in understanding it, if they can have a flexible mind, right, yeah, is a really great combination for all the reasons you just described.
So there's two things that intrigue me about this paper, or two additional things. There's a lot of things that intrigue me, but two that I want to touch on just as sort of practices for writing. And the one is that you very explicitly lay out your definitions in a table with cites, so that there's a very robust sort of foundation, because there are quite a lot of sort of conceptual ideas that people need to buy into and understand. Can you talk to us a little bit about the background of having this table, putting it in a table format as opposed to just having it in the text, and when that came in and what the discussion behind that was, such that it's now in the final version as a table with all these terms, definitions, and sources?
Yeah, so I'm going to take full credit for this one, because this comes from me being too dumb to remember what most of the definitions were. And Mark and Caitlyn, I think, were just sick of having to explain to me every time when I'd say, what do we mean by that? So they finally they're just like, look, here's a cheat sheet, use it. And that, coupled with Shad Morris was our acting AE even before this term started. And Shad was fabulous about helping us stay really focused on what we were trying to contribute, but also making it really understandable to a broader public. Because in part, we are so deeply immersed in human capital resources here in our department, and certainly Mark and I and Caitlyn now, that we forget sometimes that this is still a fairly narrow area. And Shad was great at bridging that across to make sure that we were making it both accessible for a public that didn't necessarily familiar with it, but also really defining even those terms where, you know, the three of us might have some disagreement about.
And as an outside reader, so a reader is not necessarily embedded in this literature and reading this paper for the first time, I got to say that this table was extremely helpful. And so, you know, in terms of providing feedback to authors in the future and just trying to guide papers, I think that's a really, really good practice.
Yeah, I would just, to build on that, I would say there's just no downside to authors doing that, right? It forces clarity on the author team's part, and the AE can always remove it later in the process if it's too long or not helpful. Like that.
And then talk to me a little bit about figure one. So figure one is more nuanced. You've got to spend a little bit more time with it to appreciate what's going on. What was the backstory to figure one? How did it evolve through the development of the manuscript and tying back to the propositions in the manuscript and so on? Can you give us a little bit of backstory there?
Yeah, so I think our earliest figures, as a lot of emergence papers tend to have, were just squiggly lines. So instead of, you know, showing those complicated like direction of the arrows, I think like our first rounds of figures are just very basic, emergence as a squiggly line. But I think as our thinking got a little more refined, as we started developing these mechanisms, we were able to translate the squiggly line into what we saw as really what these mechanisms, as close we could get to a visual representation of what these mechanisms were really describing in the paper. So this was a later, and Mark or Anthony, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this was a very late like change to how we had been visualizing it and showing it as we kind of started developing those mechanisms a little bit better in the writing.
I think it worked as a good writing tool for us also, because those early ones were pretty sparse. And my recollection is we would iterate between having discussions, trying to capture that in some kind of figure, and then go do some writing, which would reveal flaws in the figure, and that would lead to more conversations. And I'd be actually really interested to know how many versions of this figure we had, but it's got to be dozens and dozens and dozens.
Yeah, I think it's 24, because I keep them on little slideshow, and so like you can go back and see like the evolution from squiggly line to like.
This would be one of those places where, you know, no matter how mad we'd get at reviewer comments, or you know, that this is one that they really pushed us to do this clear. I'm paraphrasing now, but I think they repeatedly said, your figures are dumb, so fix them. But it helped because it really, as Mark said, the better we were able to get these figures focused, the better it actually helped our writing and the clarity of thought that we were bringing. So this would be one place we'd actually have to give full credit to the reviewers and to Shad again.
And this is a major theme that we've had come out of many of these AMR Origins interviews, is that the iteration that you described, Mark, between developing a figure, embedding it in the text and sort of helping it to bring the logic out, then revisiting the figure and saying, are they connected? And then reviewers pushing back on one or both of those and having to rework that iterative cycle seems to be a major theme of how conceptual papers get developed. And I'm just glad you've been able to reiterate it here. And the other thing that the figure does really nicely is just really moves between the different levels of the sort of starting with the individual employee, moving up to this unit level, and then helping conceptualize or understand how that then moves up into this human capital resources concept, which is more at the firm level, I guess. And so captures and reflects that, which is then back in the text. So that was very, very nicely done. Any other reflections on, so you've alluded to a few things. Number one, Shad pushing you to sort of make sure that it speaks to an audience outside of just the specific sort of human capital audience, and that it reflects more broadly than that. The reviewers calling your figure dumb, and pushing you to do that. Any other things that would sort of stand out in the review process that were either difficult to navigate and you had to overcome them, or were sort of breakthroughs that happened as a result of this back and forth conversation with reviewers?
Yeah, I will say that it was a challenge at first because it seemed to us, from our, not knowing, never figuring out who the reviewers were, but it seemed to us that the reviewers were not really familiar with the construct of human capital resources. So had early on asked us to, treated it, and this is obviously because of the way we wrote it, but treated as if we were introducing this new construct of HCR, when in fact we were just trying to build on the emergence process of human capital to what becomes HCR. So it was very challenging for us early on to try to walk that balance between saying, this is what's already known in the literature, don't make us rehash that, versus here's what we're trying to contribute to this. And, all of that goes to clarity of writing. So the lesson I take from it is a reminder that we have to be really careful about our audience are not the people necessarily that know the literature that we're talking about as deeply as we do. And thus we have to be really careful when we're framing these things to make sure that it's understood where the literature is, exactly what literature we're contributing to, and how we're making that contribution.
Yeah, that's incredibly valuable. And recognizing that you're actually speaking to a bigger audience than what you might initially be thinking about. And you can always sort of move in the other direction and try and anchor it more on a more sort of niche audience. But if you get that wrong if you get that wrong initially and you don't hook them in enough, then it's very hard to come back from that. What about any reflections or comments on getting other people's input through the process of, number one, developing the paper and evolving it? Did you ever present this work? Did you get any friendly reviews on this work? Was there any? You're obviously embedded in a department where this topic is a central topic, and so input from others, discussions with other doctoral students. Any thoughts on just the social process of writing and creating an AMR paper, or this paper in particular?
Yeah, I know I submitted it like as a class paper, like several times, and got feedback both from other doctoral students in the class and from the professor who's leading the seminar. I know I presented it in a brown bag in our department, which, as you said, great department for kind of people who are into multi-level thinking and in this area. So I know, I'm not sure, Mark or Anthony, if you all trying to think of other.
So I would say that broadly, all of this is a social process, right? The conversations we've had at whether it's AOM or SMS in terms of what exactly does this mean? What is the emergence process? For us who tend to be a little bit more on the what's referred to as the micro side, particularly at SMS and the Strategic Human Capital Interest Group, having conversations with people that are more in what's referred to as the macro side, so that we can get those perspectives. And then as Caitlyn referred to, I mean, here in our department, people like Rob Playhart and Paul Bleasy and Audrey Korsgaard give invaluable, regardless of whether we're presenting this paper formally, of which Caitlyn said she did, or just kind of one-off conversations, or also in reading their papers. But we did not send this out for friendly reviews or anything like that, which we know is probably best practice. We just didn't.
Yeah.
Little too much conceit, perhaps, on Mark and my part.
Cool. So what's next? Where do you what impact do you hope that the paper will have, and how has this paper influenced other things you might currently be doing or already have done? If you think about this paper as sort of a launch pad, either for you or for others, and I'd love to get each of your different perspectives on this.
So I think for me, like selfishly, I saw this as like a necessary paper for me to continue doing work in this space, just because I'm so interested in the creation of human capital resources, and we really do need more, theory and specifics so that these things can be tested and better understood. But I think another thing, kind of going back to the review process, but also talking about what's next, something that came up a lot was time. So in a version of this paper, we had, had a lot in there actually about time, given it's necessary for emergence. Emergence happens over time. And I think that's something that the three of us are all still thinking about, and really interested in providing more specificity around that as well. So I think it's necessarily kind of pushed us to how we can improve that part of the emergence process as well, or, provide better theory there.
Awesome.
Mark, go ahead. I'm still trying to, steal an idea.
Yep. So I agree with what Caitlyn said, and I think us digging into that black box probably opens the door for others to add new ideas about what's in that black box. We had, aside from the time thing, we had probably way too much scope on this, and that was something the review process helped us scale back on, but some of those ideas are still out there, and I'm sure plenty we haven't thought of could go into that black box. And I think on the practitioner side too, there's maybe not all the nuance of figure one, but in terms of if we're thinking about how you leverage the people in your organization to create value, I think these ideas of how we bring people together, how we ensure that their KSAOs are available to the unit, that they're coordinated. I think there are some lessons for managers in this way of thinking.
Yeah, and I began to think as I was reading it about the emergence of human capital resources in different sort of types of organizations, those that operate more in person and maybe more engineering focused versus those that are focused on knowledge and maybe operating more remotely or as virtual organizations. There seems to be variability in how people are going to interact and the extent to which that impacts density and coordination and a whole lot of the factors that come out in the paper. So that to me seemed like there's actually quite a lot of contingencies and nuance at the sort of unit or organizational level that may impact the extent to which these different mechanisms matter more or less.
Greg, I'm glad you think that, because we're working on kind of that very paper along with time. So I hope this means you're going to be the AE and receive it very favorably. I would say that also coming from this, it really became clear to us as we were looking through the literature that there is often still a lot of confusion between what would be aggregate human capital and versus a human capital resource. And often that's because most people only measure human capital resources through this aggregate human capital, in part because it's just hard to get the rest. So I hope that one of the things that people can take away from this is that really these human capital resources are substantively different, which has long been part of the definition, but that this gives the way you were just talking about, some context to what's really different in the process, so that at least when people are measuring it with we would call it a slightly less than satisfactory proxy, that they'll at least recognize that and maybe acknowledge that in the way that we're talking about human capital resources.
Yeah, and often to understand the substantive difference between two constructs or concepts, you've got to understand, well, what leads to each of them. And this does a really good job of understanding human capital resources, what creates these human capital resources. And by definition, they can't just be aggregate human capital because of these factors that interact in the way that you've described. So that's really cool. And for me, as a sort of outsider reading this paper, it was, I think, the whole notion of emergence, I think sort of invoking more social aspects to understanding firm level outputs was incredibly interesting. And so I hope that lots of people will read this paper, lots of people will pick it up and see it as an opportunity to do things differently in the future, or at least to think about things differently in the future. So congrats on getting it published. Good luck with the next iterations or next versions of contribution that come from this. And thank you for being so willing and open to just share a little bit of the background to coming up with the idea, writing the paper, going back and forth with reviewers, and ultimately getting it out there. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.